Hello everyone, today we talk about Operation Spider's Web as we will analyze the recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian airbases. This video is the second chapter of our history of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It was not really planned because I think that given the more, habitual pattern of the war in Ukraine, as important as it is, say, a video every 2 months is okay. But there are these events that we'll treat as specials that are incredibly important to analyze due to the broader political, strategical, and tactical implications of the case. I don't do this much to catch, views or whatever. I just found essentially the motivation to cover this topic in fair depth, which I hope will reach a larger audience, but really derives from a choice that I made, and equally, like not having talked about the war up to this point, if not just anecdotally, rests solely on me. You know that we will cover this the typical Schwerpunkt way, meaning that I often have different opinions compared to, in this case, not much strategic analysts, because dealing with the war in Ukraine in detail, because I'm not an expert in contemporary warfare. I haven't really ever, of course, researched outside of my field of expertise that is far back in time. However, I think that there are certain aspects that are of extraordinary interest for a big number of reasons, not just because this war is really big compared to most of what we got habituated to, especially in Europe, as you know, up to several decades ago. And that, of course, by being spread will, greatly help people, because this is the actual point of Schwerpunkt that I often discuss, like especially at the beginning of the channel, that is properly spreading a much greater awareness about what really constitutes strategic culture, strategic analysis, the development of a military historical awareness that is not merely notional, nor, let's say, just a patchwork of information without a logic, but it really always fits the pattern interpretation that von Clausewitz gave us. Like most strategic analysts basically go with war, especially because they like to make sensationalism about it for themselves, not even about like the gravity of the war or what this means in a strictly political sense. In part, there is also that. There are a lot of people who ride these topics in a and it's completely understandable to be partisan, but in a way that truly bends, like that properly lies. There are, fortunately, at least in the West, enough good coverages of the war in order to be fairly well informed about it. But there is also just, aside from the falsifiers, some sources that tend to push for just like a subjectivistic and emotionalistic narrative of this all that, of course, we don't care about, but are really influential in many ways. Besides, every strategic analyst have their different ideas, and they mostly tend by attitude to present, mostly because they do not have, and believe me, this is the case, they do not have a military historical formation. All right, they study politology, sometimes even other topics like economics, engineering. Maybe they are experts in a specific set of political, relational topics between countries, or they study certain financial policies, or maybe they really study the actual development of the country's militaries, but they have never really carried out a deep study of military history and specifically of the art of war throughout the centuries to get. And even just from a theoretical point of view, let's skip the problem of von Clausewitz that is being, obscured by culturalism in the 20th, 21st century still, with all the dreadful damages and other unintended consequences of the case. But that mostly really tend to make that this history is this type of war is new, right? Or this von Clausewitz could be the example, like did not conceive what is really happening now. this mostly happens because of lack of perspective, right? It's mostly lack of culture in general, lack of actual education, but it really stems from the fact that nobody understands why we should listen to strategic analysis by people who have not carried out an intensive professional research of the art of war in their life, which they don't. And I talk plenty of videos explaining what the art of war is as opposed to military history. There's a lot of notionism and making parallelisms between wars, even without properly concentrating on what concretely happens. And I will cut off this tangent now because we really have a lot to discuss. But it is to say, let's really realize that warfare does not stop to the news, but it also does not stop to the opinion of the alleged expert that tells you about it, right? There is always some deeper understanding of that. And it's very difficult to cover a topic like this, by the way. In theory, I recorded this, we are on June the 3rd, so with material that I also collected today. So things, more news occur, that today, as this video was being researched, was the Ukrainian attack on the Kerch Bridge. There are a bunch of news we will also tell later that, however, we can't immediately catch up with. And essentially, what happened. On June the 1st, 2025, just let's go into it. The Security Service of Ukraine executed Operation Spider's Web. This was a large-scale drone attack targeting Russian Air Force long-range aviation assets at 5 air bases scattered at the extremities of Russia: Belaya in the Irkutsk Oblast, Diaghilev in Ryazansk Oblast, Ivanovo-Severnivny in Ivanovsk Oblast, Olenia in Murmansk Oblast, and Ukrainka in Amur Oblast. The name comes from the far end of the frontier, the Ukraine of the east, right in the Slavic language. So what happened? It happened that at dawn of June the 1st, the Ukrainian military intelligence service, the Holovne Upravlenia Rodzvidki Ministerstva Oborony Ukraini, service, literally the International Legion of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, struck a series of Russian bases with drones, launching them from automated container trucks and making use of artificial intelligence to execute the operation without direct involvement of human operators. Actually, it's not known whether the automation was total or partially remote, and if so, to what extent. We will address this topic now. So, there are also unconfirmed reports suggesting strikes on the naval base of Severomorsk in Murmansk and another base as far as the Amur. We will not mostly deal with these. The events, anyway, of the past couple of days have been marked by expectedly enough, given as we'll see now, the actual damage inflicted to the Russian airborne strategic fleet, the circulation of numerous outdated videos misrepresented as current, exaggerating figures concerning damages from one side or minimizing them from another. So being part of the absolutely normal competing propaganda narratives from Russian and Ukrainian sources. This is, again, completely normal. I've been incredibly vocal on Schwerpunkt about the positivity of propaganda, and especially the actually good one, right? You know what propagandum means in Latin, the plural, is what needs to, probably the things that need to be propagated, need to spread for sound reason. I also explained also my theological viewpoint on that. We will not hear, this channel, as you know, is biased in favor of Ukraine, but it's, I'm just telling you what we know, but I'm not going to bend the narrative to that. Like, one thing is critically analyzing the situation, being partisan because you believe in certain things and you have certain affiliations and identity and more. Another thing is just saying, okay, this thing is false, if it is true, or vice versa. It's difficult, of course, that nobody has the truth in his pockets, right? This is definitely not the channel is going to take the most flamboyantly exaggerated estimates of Russian losses just to please whoever is from that side. Here we make like an attentively objective military historical and strategical analysis that in this sense is useful to assess, at least as I was saying before, not making comparisons with other events, but helping you to understand in perspective what emerged as an interpretative problem also for other events. For example, I'm preparing a video about the Taranto air raid, right? I remember years ago, there was, I think, military history visualized that passed from one of those allegedly accurate, reliable channels that tended to say, oh, well, but after all, this didn't really damage too much Italian ships. The Italian repaired them. In the bigger picture, it wasn't this material damage. Exactly. Like if you reason exclusively in terms of numbers or stats, you're not making a military historical analysis. You're completely missing the entire point of war, that is a matter of moral forces that reciprocally influence one another, and especially the most important aspect, the instrumental subordination of war to politics. That is to say, why are these military operations carried out, right? There is always a specific goal that is not just inherently a strategic one, but is the mean to a broader end. And that's in that light that we interpret such things. Now, just to make an example, also from the other side, the Russian authorities, they're definitely not the ones who lie the less in all this, and that actually systematically lie as basically their own sole national identity, frequently assert that only insignificant targets such as brush or grass were struck, which, as we actually can very well see from the actual images, that the Ukrainians, by the way, spread not, as we'll see now, not much for a public purpose, but for a specifically, say, informational one for the Russians, right? To the Russian government and the Russian military to show what's going on, because they are aiming to, in fact, bring about a much greater concern that will necessarily oblige the Russians to invest resources to protect their various assets, given the specific technology and effects in that of operation that the Ukrainians employed in particular here. It's never even just about the technology per se here. That is a quite interesting aspect of the story. In fact, we will expand on the even more important one, that is a matter of intelligence here, and it's a matter of what is happening within Russia. And if you know about the event here, you know where we're getting with that, because this is really big, right? This is really big, and I absolutely agree that to some extent, militarily wise, in a purely military sense, this is, of course, just a secondary thing, but the ramifications of this in the war at a moral level and more are going to be incredibly important. And of course, like, there are also the claims often employed by Russian propagandists to minimize the impact of attacks. We do not really care about that either. So evidence confirms that significant military assets were targeted, though not to the extent claimed, at least by some Ukrainian sources. And again, they also do their propaganda. You may agree or disagree with how they do that, but there is always a mean to an end in a much more intricate, in fact, spider's web that is exactly the point of this all, as we will get in the end. In any case, our analysis here seeks to clarify at least these discrepancies and provide a comprehensive assessment of the operation's execution and implications, blending factual accounts, emerging details, and informed speculation, because, of course, we must not know everything, right? The Ukrainians really must. Now, an inquiry was raised concerning just a random thing before we get into that, the physical appearance of Russian General Valery Gerasimov, specifically the size of his neck, looks like a duck, right? Hyper, fattened by foie gras, attributed, in fact, to the physical burden of military command causing a hunched posture. Regarding the Ukrainian-American relations today, I would like to say two things and not to comment, but they are actually incredibly telling. Trump today said, "Why does Ukraine keep doing these big operations against Russia so early in the morning? I'm trying to sleep here. It's ridiculous." I'm sending a very strong note of protest to President Zelensky. Very strong. From now on, I demand all operations be conducted after my lunch. That's fair. That's classy. Let's keep it civilized, folks. I'm not going to comment on this, but you perfectly understand what that actually means, which is something that everybody knew very well in advance, even, of course, before Trump's election, regarding his obvious support of Ukraine. And today, just President Zelensky's chief of staff in Washington with a Ukrainian delegation to meet Trump admin officials and ask support in the fight against Russia's ongoing invasion. He says, if Russia refuses to stop the aggression voluntarily, we are compelled to conduct operations and destroy its military potential. Now, these are observations relatively irrelevant to the operational discussion of Spiderweb. In any case, prior to a detailed examination, it's necessary to consider still the propaganda implications and the meticulous planning of the operation, with new details emerging within the last days. There are, of course, some propagandists that basically have to say that at the root of all this, that basically 4 years ago, Europe's strategic position was compromised, and that advocate even for surrender, that as if, by the way, that the Russian military had ever concretely threatened from a conventional view, meaning literally the only possible one, given that anything beyond that would result in the complete destruction of at least of the globe. So the Russian Federation, primarily in response from a Western mutual response, the conventional gap with NATO is astonishing. It's of course one that has rapidly increased also in the last years, given the current commitment of Russian forces in Ukraine. In any case, Spiderweb has prompted reflection on probably its methods, particularly the use of satellite imagery for planning, which was deemed significant in this. Importantly, there is an important informed speculation based on the available evidence, particularly regarding the layouts of the targeted Russian air bases, because the layouts were reportedly utilized to train artificial intelligence systems for autonomous aircraft targeting. Released imagery indicates that the Ukrainian drones were programmed to recognize aircraft silhouettes and execute terminal guidance autonomously, striking Russian aircraft in their final flight phase, right? So, yeah, basically these drones were activated and they did everything by themselves. At least this is, we don't fully understand that. We don't fully know, as we'll explain now through the technicalities, whether there was some kind of external human control to guide properly the drones. But the former hypothesis is considered highly plausible, aligning with the observed precision of the same attacks. It's also unlikely that the same, some kind of turncoat within the Russian military personnel would carry this out by therefore requiring photographic aids to identify their own Tupolev aircraft, right? Suggesting that the imagery was intended to, if anything, show the Russians what, in fact, the Ukrainians are now capable of doing, rather than even informing the public about it. In fact, we don't have this enormous amount of footage from the attacks. Yes, it's pretty consistent, but it's literally showing the fact that these drones operated basically following a quite mechanical guidance, right? So again, as we were saying before, if it had been some kind of traitor within the Russian forces, everything would have been easily guided from talking within the airfield. So to attack so schematically, we can also think that they would have sabotaged the aircraft on land. In fact, this is not really much of a plausible hypothesis. There was, however, within Russia, an inside job, at least to the degree. We'll explain now, possibly also of national participation, regarding some Russians that we know having actually passed to the Ukrainian side and having disappeared sometime after the war. But mostly we know this. The operation complexity has even probably led to comparisons with a modern Trojan horse described as a truck or container of deceit, generating significant online discourse and memes, by the way. So the action was conducted quite significantly by the Ukrainian GUR, infiltrating deep into Russian territory with trucks, carrying fake prefabricated houses, so-called, on their platforms. So, of course, containing the drones instead. In fact, inside, these were hidden, programmed to carry out the attack, again, apparently autonomously, and quite likely autonomously. Once the trucks parked in the planned areas, a short distance from the target bases, the roofs of the prefabricated houses opened, and the drones took flight, governed by AI and executing the attack. In total, it is said that 150 drones were involved, some of which were reconnaissance drones through which the GUR monitored and coordinated the action remotely. So as far as those are concerned, like not the strikers, but the reconnaisseurs monitored the entire mechanism, also just for, of course, getting uninformed experience from the whole action, recording it. The others were suicide drones that exploded, hitting the Russian aircraft. A critical aspect involves drones concealed within these prefabricated wooden containers transported by the trucks, because we don't know exactly how they were distributed. Estimates suggest each container held approximately 32 to 40 drones, calculated as 2, 4, 4, 8, 6, 10, 12, 14, 16 drones per side, for example. So in this case, totaling 32, with additional drones possibly hidden on the opposite side, suggesting, again, 32 to 40 drones per container. Further estimates propose up to 50 drones, with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 drones per row, totaling 40 or 50. Anyway, it's unclear whether some trucks carried multiple containers, though this is considered possible. The logistics of controlling such a number of drones, potentially requiring 40 operators or 2, 3, or 4 drones per operator, resulting in approximately 10 operators, which would render thus manual control implausible, just per se. This logistical challenge is a primary reason for proposing the alternative hypothesis, autonomous or semi-autonomous drone operation. The drones likely utilized Russia's cellular network, that is the 4G/LTE, to transmit imagery, facilitating damage assessment. Local repeaters may have supported communication. However, remote control of all drones across vast distances simultaneously, as it happened, as we will see now, this very widely scattered locations at the extremes of the huge Russian territory, including Siberia, is deemed unfeasible, reinforcing the AI-guided hypothesis. At the end of the action, at least one of the trucks self-destructed. When Russian security identified it, containers were likely rigged with explosives to self-destruct, possibly to eliminate evidence if a drone failed, potentially triggered by the final drone's activation or a timer. Some containers may have detonated to avoid leaving evidence, a mechanism possibly linked to the last drone's launch or a timer. The battle damage assessment is not yet complete, but according to Ukraine, up to 41 heavy bombardment aircraft were damaged, including the Tupolev 95, the 22, and at least one A-50 surveillance radar aircraft. The latter, if confirmed, would be the last operational one in Russian Air Force's inventory, which is quite interesting. Now, the numbers naturally are all to be verified, but as in the case of the air battle between India and Pakistan last month, for example, commercial satellite photos will be able to confirm or deny these figures relatively quickly. Military ones, as usual, will remain classified and provide material for classified studies for years to come. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed that 35% of Russia's cruise missile carrier fleet was damaged, specifically 34%, equating to 117 drones. By the way, why this was done at this point, because of the recent Russian strategic bombing strikes on Ukraine that, as you know, carry these cruise missiles and are, normally caught up in time, because we know essentially the moment in which these bombers take off, and are this asset that is naturally difficult to take down in other ways. There are precedents to this, as we will see now. This operation was planned for a long time, but we should not expand too much now on the political reasons why this operation was carried out now. Probably there were important concerns also due to the fact that the more time it passes, especially for this long operation, to be meticulously prepared, that the more chances there are for you to be discovered, and so for it to basically fail. But it's a very deep and powerful symbol, not just because literally, this is insane. I mean, as we'll see now, the overall damage caused to the Russian military capabilities is scarce, right? But the mere fact that an entire part of a major power's strategic bombing fleet can be basically destroyed or damaged in such fashion, by the way, on such scattered territory, that should have been like one advantage of Russia, and that is instead is predictably turning out to amplify the disproportionately so the costs of this war is really incredible. Aside from the drone technology, that again, also personally speaking, I don't think is going to eventually go more and far, because people say, oh my God, everything's changed now, all drones will happen. It's not like drones cost like everything else, right? It's not like drones take terrain or can supplant artillery or tanks, even though, of course, they can inflict heavy damage on the latter. The more drones you produce, the more the enemy will, and that costs. It costs not just in terms of overall production, but literally also of crews that have to operate them, launching stations, or at least all a system of also of the dislocation that can be targeted, etc. And so at some point there will be a saturation where we will realize, okay, yes, we can produce the stuff quite cheaply, but at the end of the day, we can't quite carry out an entire war with this. It's not meant to simply go that direction. There is always a cost, right? It's not like magically drones are the infinitely cheap thing that can take over everything. No, right? Every technology has a cost. It has to be adequately integrated in a employment doctrine, and that's all another story. I'm not even beginning to talk about this today. The implications, if anything, are something else. As I was saying before, the strategic analysts would mostly focus on this fact, oh my God, the great technological revolution. Whereas what this operation, as we'll see also in the end, really means is, first of all, deeply political. And again, here we're fully Clausewitzian in line. Properly, what is happening within Russia right now, in which sense? How much the Ukrainians have learned, of course, to exploit Russia, the enemy weakness. And it is this entire deal of war, placing the enemy in a condition of inferiority by exploiting asymmetries. And again, there is all almost physical concept behind the struggle properly of a war machine, and how on the long run it can't really jam, because at some point even the support, the will to fight in all this is going to be subordinated to yields that are definitely already are actually really unworthy. If anything, we are seeing Ukrainians and Russians, of course, of both sides, learning how to make war, as other countries have not the palest idea of, and of course getting to this genial in terms of actual carrying out, because this is Mossad level, by the way, intelligence-wise. It was really an insanely well-crafted and incredible operation from the Ukrainians. But also, in a sense, obvious if you think about what you can do with drones and what the Ukrainians already have done against the Russian Federation. And again, exactly exploiting the enormity of the territory that compels the Russians to invest proportionally much more for their own, if anything, anti-drone defense, and more than at least in different ways, the Ukrainians really do, with a relative advantage from their own side. And also an operation that unfortunately can't be easily repeated, which is, however, not much the problem of Ukrainians, because if the Russians put themselves in the conditions of not suffering a strike of this anymore, will have committed, again, many other resources to an end that is not, in fact, an offensive one, and that is going to wait further on their own offensive one. Now, going back to the point, there are fake news circulating, such as the fact that these drones would have been evaluated $7 billion. Absolutely not. They were much cheaper. There is yet another fake news that states that they were funded by the same Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is just belonging to the exaggerated, hyperbolic, and fantasy sort of side of propaganda. Tom Cooper, I don't know if you know him, probably, like if you follow at least the main military analysts of the war in Ukraine, Sarcastosaurus, there is a site that a blog he updates regularly. This guy, I honestly don't like him, characterly speaking. He is pro-Ukraine, but I honestly don't like very much the way in which he is, meaning that, in my opinion, some of his actual assessments are wrong. I also strongly disagree with his take on Israel, etc. So I don't want to say here nothing, also because I don't really know too much about him in his background, but he's a worthy source to read anyway. And he is disliked also by other observers. He, if anything, is an expert in aerial warfare to an important degree. He published lots of volumes about different wars, including, in fact, the one in Ukraine, on the subject. And he provided a cautious assessment, avoiding overly optimistic projections. This is true because, as I said, from a strictly military point of view, this is amazing. For example, at the operational level, at a tactical level, this was a masterpiece, right? But in terms of the bigger maths, right, even the actual Russian bombing capacities are just so reduced just by some degree, nor that is the main problem, actually, that Ukrainians have in the moment in general, nor, in fact, the greatest worry the Russians have from their own side. But, as I said before, from a moral point of view, this is big. And when I say moral, again, I don't really mean, oh my God, now I feel down, say the Russian says because these attacks occurred. No, that's not how we intend by moral, but let's say it's questions regarding properly the vulnerability of Russia, how this will be perceived, and what kind of posture the same government and the military will take in front of this vulnerability. That ends up making defeatism, even when say the doom is not there, right? And he's, again, rightly annoyed at, of course, all the political laziness in his support towards Ukraine, all the fake news, mostly just the hypocrisy of even the same supporters of Ukraine because of the scarcity of the help. And we can all reflect ourselves into that. But in my opinion, he blends a bit too much personal political opinion in sort of too general, or at least too hopeless fashions, right? It's that, liberals tend to have, it's just a character matter. I can't even say that what he states in his analysis is wrong. Just on some of them, I partially disagree. But liberals tend to do this. Like they're the forever sort of the guys who feel oppressed for some reason, therefore have this negativistic view on the world, rather than say, okay, let's be positive about the thing, even when we need to put pressure in order to get support. By the way, the guy collects a great deal of donations, etc. So absolutely chapeau to his effort. I just sort of can't stand him in a personal way. And maybe if I met him personally, it would be different. But that's not even of interest. Why is Cooper relevant? Well, of course, because of his aforementioned aviation expertise that lends credibility to his restrained evaluation, contrasting with the celebratory tone of some pro-Ukrainian commentators. Cooper's analysis is sobering, emphasizing the need to assess the operation's actual impact on the war, rightly enough, rather than its symbolic or propaganda value, even though, again, about the latter, we will see mostly an intelligence perspective on this, because I think there is really much more than, especially the Russians notoriously give out, right? Cooper mostly addresses the celebratory reactions from pro-Ukrainian supporters by tempering them with an objective evaluation of evidence. And of course, he also doesn't speculate much. Zelensky, by the way, publicly acknowledged responsibility for the operation, describing it as a brilliant success, as it was undeniably. At the moment, I don't know if in the next hours, I haven't checked because I came back home from dinner, like I wouldn't tell you, but visual confirmations speak of about 10 aircraft. Visual confirmation is very important. There are entire communities that tell you, even since the beginning of the war, how many tanks have been found with marks on where it was the same piece, let's say, to evaluate losses that, as you know, up to a certain point are basically incalculable, are mostly just broader assessment, etc. And at least for this specific operation, we have at least so much to cover, and we can assess 10 aircraft destroyed and as many damaged. Then we'll stay tuned to see if more certain data arrives later. Probably I will cover this in the next episode of the, if any, of the regular coverage of the war in Ukraine, even though it will probably have become fairly relevant by that point. But it must also be noted that in the current Russian logistical conditions, that is to say, chronic shortage of spare parts and bomber assembly lines closed for 20 years, a damaged bomber is a bomber that will not fly again in this war. So when we look at those 10 plus 10, say, we must acknowledge that without even some few missing parts, damaged parts, those bombers will not likely take off again, right? And probably either they're going to be decommissioned or whatever it's going to happen, depending on or not depending on the war. High resolution synthetic aperture radar imagery from the day before the attack, so May the 31st, confirms losses at Belaya, including 3 Tupolev 22 M3S destroyed, 1 Tupolev 95 MS destroyed, and 1 Tupolev 95 MS damaged. Olenia losses are confirmed, though less precise. Total losses are up to 11, with 8-9 probable, primarily at Belaya and Olenia. An AN-12 was hit, but its value is limited. Regarding the A-50, claims at Ivanovo Severny are supported by debris imagery for this aircraft, but prior images show similar debris, casting doubt on whether this would have derived from a conflagration. Diaghilevo reported 10 explosions, with recent unverified footage showing white and black smoke, possibly hits or Russian smoke screens that, given the drone visual recognition, are actually an interesting limit, right? Just like to human eye. Ukrainka's imagery is a low-resolution Sentinel image showing a mark where an aircraft was on May the 27th, but absent on June the 1st. So the mark's small size and prior presence suggests it may not indicate destruction, as a matter of fact. Fire signatures near Ukrainka dated to a couple of days before may indicate natural fires or aircraft displacement, complicating assessments. Anyway, both Ukrainian and Russian claims are at the moment unreliable. There are different reasons for that are exquisitely political, because of course the respective armed forces know better what's the whole picture. Now, there's also the, in my opinion, more interesting aspect of the story for different reasons. Now, Russian investigators interrogated the truck drivers involved in the operation, revealing a sophisticated infiltration scheme. Alexander Z, a 55-year-old driver from Chelyabinsk, reported that his truck, owned by a 37-year-old named Artem Timofeyev, was contracted by a businessman from Murmansk to transport 4 prefabricated containers from Chelyabinsk to the Kola district near Faktiolenia airbase. During transit, an unknown individual provided specific instructions via phone on where to stop, with the final one near a Rosneft gas station, where drones were launched. Andrei M., a 60-year-old driver, reported a similar experience transporting containers to Irkutsk and stopping near the Teremov Cafe in Uzolye Sibirskoye, where drones unexpectedly launched from his truck. Right? So basically, these truckers had nothing to do. They didn't know what this thing was about. Drivers in Ryazan and Ivanovo reported comparable experiences. Sergei Kanurin, aged 46, described a container roof opening suddenly in Ryazan, releasing drones, while a truck in Ivanovo loaded in Chelyabinsk was involved in a prior attack on Ivanovo-Severny airbase on May 31st of the same 2025. Russian authorities in Irkutsk are essentially searching for this Artem Timofeyev, whose name may be false, right? Reported as the owner of the trucks from which drones were launched. Timofeyev purchased a warehouse in Chelyabinsk to store the containers later collected by the drivers. Open source intelligence suggests that the drones were sourced from Kazakhstan, thus exploiting Russian import routes, possibly through a fabricated procurement scheme. Interestingly enough, like, Kazakhstan is also not Russia. And as you know, also before the 2022 invasion, December 2021, there was an attempted coup that we seem to have all collectively forgotten, and that surely had some interesting implications behind that. And again, 1/5 of the Russian people living in Russia is basically like a Turkic Muslim from former, in fact, Soviet republics of Central Asia. That definitely does not make Russia stand out as what some people inexplicably think to be some kind of bulwark of European tradition, or aside from the levels of abortion, divorce, atheism, slavery, literal slavery. 6% of the Russian population, chronic alcoholism. I'm stopping here, but for some reason. And so this openness of Russia, especially its reliance on external resources at this point, given, and fairly also shady resources, given the general, the sanctions, blockades, and restrictions on its trade, like, for all those people who say, but, the sanctions do not work. Who said that? Why? They are inflicting massive burden on the Russian economy. It's not like they're faring well at all. The fact that they're resilient or have solid fundamentals does not mean that the system does not suffer from this to a very important degree. It's been speculated Timofeyev may be, in fact, a Ukrainian. Some say, I don't understand exactly, like, now the sources say from Zhytomyr, And Ukrainian forces likely exploited Russian import triangulation corridors for this, used for acquiring restricted goods to deliver drones undetected, as well as all the shady stuff that Russians habitually do, by also unavoidably exposing themselves to this kind of risks. The drivers' accounts are supported by videos showing their surprise and attempts to stop the drones. Right, this is ridiculous to watch, by the way. Confirmed they were unaware of their cargo's nature, indicating they were unwitting participants in a meticulously planned operation. It's not clear whether the truck drivers were unaware Russians or Ukrainian agents yet. The Russian police support the first hypothesis and claim to have identified the Ukrainian quote-unquote mastermind of the operation, naturally a bird flown the coup. Ukrainian sources indicate the operation required 1 year and 8 months of preparation. So this, as you understand, was not just a contingental operation. It was not just a Russian slip. The Ukrainians worked very hard for this and with excellent result. Its success raises, as we were hinting at before, questions about replicability, as Russian forces are unlikely to be caught off guard again, a common limitation of such meticulously planned operations. Nevertheless, again, the ethics are, in my opinion, very, very, very hard. The decision to execute may have been prompted by concerns that prolonged preparation increased detection risks, as maintaining a partially ready operation heightens exposure. Surely there was some broader political point to this. You have seen what has been happening in the last days, regardless of the possible Ukrainian reaction to the last, in fact, strategic bombardments and civilian casualties. Are really the single most stupid thing Russians can do, because even if they, let's assume they don't give a damn about Ukrainian lives, but it's completely wasted resources on that, right? It's not going to bring any actual benefit to them, nor politically, nor militarily. And we will see now how and why, and what basically these strategic bombers, together with the Russian Air Force in general, is reduced to do, which is also, again, ridiculous, given the alleged, the power of the alleged second military power in the world, at the beginning of the war at least. Now, but again, more of the intelligence implications later. Failed attempts of this operation may have occurred previously, right, undetected by public sources, because we know just so much, right? So this is evidenced, for example, by an earlier drone attack on a Russian bomber 2 years ago. I don't know if you remember, they destroyed it entirely. It was just potentially a test for this very operation, because again, it was more or less like decided after that episode, at least, to establish this, to work for this specific operation. Historical context includes an April 2024 attack on a Tatarstan base producing component for Smershgrad and Uragan artillery. You probably also remember that. This was also struck again recently in a secondary attack amid this very operation. So surely, of course, everything is used to gain intelligence, to acquire experience, to test how more or less these attacks can operate, the Russian defenses, probably the feasibility, the precision of the attacks, the eventual damage on the targets. A single drone hit a fuel tank near a bomber, for example, causing limited damage. Misinformation, including recycled videos, there are bits obviously thrown in the meat grinder. Some media also fall with all their shoes into that, has, of course, complicated assessments of smaller bases in this raid, like the one on the Agilevo, where information remains scarce and unclear. The primary focus is, however, on Belaya and Olenia, with Ivanovo-Severny also claimed as a target due to its role as a transit hub for Russian A-50 airborne early warning and control aircraft. No conclusive evidence confirms losses at Ivanovo-Severny, though unverified reports suggest debris from downed drones. Videos show drones launching from containers, with civilians and drivers literally attempting to intervene using improvised tools like sticks, stones, and feet, climbing onto trucks to stop them, indicating their surprise. So they understood that these were drones and what was essentially going on. The drones did not launch simultaneously, by the way, but in a gradual, continuous manner, suggesting a staggered release mechanism. Civilian efforts may have mitigated damage, as only Belaya and Olenia sustained confirmed significant losses, while other bases reported fewer or no confirmed hits. But again, we do not precisely know. Surely, in order to operate these drones, like the technical limitations would have necessitated a staggered takeoff, because they couldn't simply like open all the prefabricated houses at once and go out all at once. Would have not been possible. In some cases, as we hinted at before, trucks self-detonated. Thus, civilians and drivers who intervened risked their lives, with one individual who entered a container reportedly killed, though specific casualties are unconfirmed. Their actions may have saved additional aircraft, as only Belaya and Olenia were heavily impacted. Well, again, we don't know too much about the rest. The targeted air bases include these interesting positions because Belaya and Irkutsk Oblast is extremely remote. The same goes for Ukrainka in the Amur Oblast, far in the east near China, with limited information, especially on the latter. Olenia and Belaya have the most verified data. Satellite imagery from May 26th indicates Olenia hosted 40 Tupolev's 22 M3 bombers, 11 Tupolev 95 MS bombers, and 5 AN-12 transport aircraft, with some assets in a secondary section. The AN-12s are transport aircraft, so the focus is mostly on the Tupolev's 22 M3 and 95 MS bombers. Not all the former are operational, by the way, as Russia maintains a surplus, with many in storage or used for parts almost in excess relative to missile stocks, as we will look at later. The Tupolev 95 MS bombers are regularly used in Ukraine, right? Probably the ones used to bombard the country, carrying up to 14 cruise missiles each, though typically 40 to 60 missiles are launched per strike, rarely reaching 100. In any case, this tells you the amount of firepower. Logically, 5 to 8 bombers are needed for 100 missile strikes. Russian forces rotate bombers, deploying 5 to 10 per mission, with others undergoing maintenance in Siberia, such as at Belaya or Ukrainka, to sustain operations. What this rotation does is minimizing wear, with bombers performing one mission, then moving to maintenance, replaced by others, ensuring sustainability. And so avoiding unnecessary accidents and, say, more structural degradation. This strategy may be adjusted following the attack, of course. We will talk about this better now. Tupolev 95 MS bombers launch KH-101 missiles, numerous but easier to intercept, not always at full capacity due to sufficient availability. An attack near a Kiev hospital involved a KH-101 missile. Tupolev 22M missiles using sparingly carry 1 or 2 KH-22/KH-32 missiles, difficult to intercept but limited by missile stockpiles, meaning Russia has more bombers than missiles. This is, again, also part of the obvious situation for all the people who still somehow bark at imaginary propaganda, not even the one exists, saying that, somebody's claiming that Russia has finished missiles, and at every time a missile is shot, say, look, who said that Russia had finished it? Do you really have an idea of what was like, the first year of the war and what is happening right now? Russia has reached the peak of regime production, and that still struggles, of course, to maintain any of what was at the beginning of the war. This is just the ABC of the entire story. Now, KH missiles are powerful. They are used against high-value targets not launched in large numbers, unlike the 101 specifically. Spiderweb's operational brilliance lies in its execution, comparable to Mossad once using AI-guided drones to target fuel tanks in aircraft wings, as evidenced by videos showing consistent strikes. This causes significant damage by igniting fires that spread to critical components. The success, so the fuel tanks, of course, of the same aircraft, right? Because as we said before, that nearby tanks were hit, but with different results. We definitely see this in the available imagery, the level of destruction. The success would have risked open war in earlier eras, like the Cold War. I mean, if conducted, for example, by the US through Ukrainian intelligence sources, right? And this tells you how different our times really are. And so also the straw man of nuclear war and escalation, all the umpteenth red lines the Russians wrote and nothing ever happens, of course, aside from pretty obscene bombardments of civilians that, however, are not going beyond that massacre. We have, as we said at the beginning, the estimate of 2024 aircraft losses far below the 41 publicly claimed. This, again, is important for many reasons, boosting the Ukrainian morale or to, in general, show the world that of course Ukraine is not just capable of doing so, but doing something that is objectively big. Even if, again, the losses are half of that against the Russian strategic bombing fleet. For Belaya and Olenia, drones provided clear damage assessment footage, while other bases footage shows drones approaching but cuts off, indicating no assessment drone, possibly due to interception or failure. In other footage, you can see the Russian AA guns that, however, do not even seem to be particularly apt to the task. Now, this, of course, limits Ukraine's certainty about losses at Diaghilevo, Ivanovo, Severny, and Ukrainka. The action is extremely significant, nevertheless, as was the interruption of the Kerch bridge that today, as we were saying, was once again attacked, and the traffic was stopped momentarily, but it also resumed during the day. But it was an important gesture together with what has been happening in the previous days. And the first thing spiderwebs comparatively remind you is the sinking of the Moskva, the Russian admiral flagship that was, sunk in the Black Sea. However, it's not, of course, anything like a military turning point in the war, and it does not impact operations at the front. As usual, it's necessary to separate the military reality on the ground, the real reality on the ground, not like what I tell other people. Do you even know what the military reality of the ground is? Yeah, because I studied that, right? So unless you are there and you want to tell us what the reality from the ground is while you're getting bombed and without, at least a higher position up in the officers' ranks, rather, I don't see what kind of rhetoric that is supposed to be. But where indeed the outcome of the war largely passes, there is also, of course, the virtual war fought on the media front, and there we get mostly in the field of politics, where, of course, the objective is not the enemy's armed forces, but the Russian, Ukrainian, but above all Western populations and public opinion, whose morale can at least heavily influence what we continue to repeat is the only true variable of the war, right? It is to say the Western, especially European support for Ukraine, because it's not like the Americans are, of course, less important, but the actual repartition of resources that witnesses, also depending on whether you look at money or weapons, etc., is definitely would be much easier to provide by a much more stably military competitive Europe in function of a properly cohesive will to simply back Ukraine and making it the greater bulwark of our Europe, at least the main one exposed to the front line, as long as NATO protection is not going to be provided, at least in the conventional way. This is the support that Moscow hopes to interrupt and that Kyiv wants to maintain at all costs. We all know it. I have my own opinion on this. That is to say, it doesn't matter how slow and lazy the West is in this, the Russians are hopeless in this struggle, right? The notion that Russia can basically overcome Ukrainian resistance per se, and that, let's say, in a more dire situation, the Western support would magically evaporate, is frankly ridiculous. And as time passes, this does actually not favor the Russians at all. But this, again, is another, matter compared to this. It's just to give a bit of context. Part of the media work conducted by Putin to break Ukrainian and European morale is represented, for example, by the terrorist bombing campaign on Ukrainian cities. These are terrorist bombings in that they do not aim to hit the enemy's war effort, right? They almost never hit military targets, but rather to terrorize the population in the same way. In other times in history, this could be considered. And again, it's probably one of the dumbest things ever, right? Hoping that the Ukrainians would basically give up because you're bombing their cities is basically the dumb, the entire issue. Like, so what happened since 2014 passing through 2022 as the nail on the coffin of the hopes that Russia would essentially be understood as a shared motherland of Ukrainians or whatever. After, by the way, the very obvious historical events that definitely do not point toward that direction, that always basically brought Ukrainians to be exploited and mistreated, to say the least, by any Russian imperial policy. It's something that would have, first of all, just emerged historically, but it's literally, in fact, even it under our own eyes. Before we were commenting on, for example, the scarcity of missiles. It's not like the Russians do not bomb Ukrainian cities now because, in theory, of course, they could do much worse if they wanted. But again, first of all, it's also triggering a Western reaction. When Ukraine is bombed in the West moves at every step, right? So the more you do that, the more you elicit a reaction, in a concrete one, because so far, regardless of the overall shortcomings that also Cooper highlights, there has been an actual response every single time in quite concrete military and economic ways that have been gradually building up, by the way, to further sustain Ukraine, that in many ways is actually hardening its defense. But is also literally getting nowhere properly as far as Ukrainian morale is concerned. It's not like if you bomb Ukrainian cities, you destroy Ukraine. Let's absolutely, first of all, there's been, in spite of the enormous hatred between the two contendants, some kind of boundary that I would say the Russians, again, did not, took mostly the worst of, in the sense that if they were this untouchable power that every time got scratched started launching nukes for all this alleged red lines, and if that was the reputation that they wanted to maintain also as far as domestic policy is concerned and general international relevance, yes, Ukrainian civilian losses were disproportionate in absolute terms, but they also yielded an enormous sense not just of resilience of the Ukrainian population and sympathy in the rest of the world, even among those states that basically didn't care. Like, remember when Lavrov, when the war began, Lavrov went over to India and he said, the Ukrainians attacked us, and the entire Indian crowd began to laugh at him. They were in theory like to cooperate. Then India, of course, also it's a shady country in many ways, but it's sort of realigned for obvious reasons with the West in broader terms, regardless of help provided at some point. It's initially buying oil and more. That was Lavrov's mission at that time. But it sounds terribly cynical, but this Ukrainian losses have actually not just steered Ukrainian resistance in the boldness and in the positive military intent to strike, like in this raid, for example, and on other occasions, significant, ideas, at least, of Russian security. Remember that random drone on the Kremlin at some point. That is something that the Russians didn't basically react to. And from one side, of course, it is a matter of sort of rational. It's not, the Russians are military. There were moments in which they were risking something from a military point of view. And we'll have to talk about this because there are at least two specific moments in the war during 2022 and 2023 that may have, even though unlikely, but turning in the actual collapse of the entire Russian front. And I'm not talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'm talking something else. This sacrifice, the fact of having showed the world that you can actually resist to Russia as a much lower ranked military, and as a people, especially that the Russians deny the existence of as literal Ukrainians from any political, linguistical, historical, national, cultural point of view, is something that has conferred Ukraine an aura of moral superiority that here is winning in all fields, right? And so it is true that the toll paid by Ukraine is warring. It's not like wars can drag on forever, but as we were discussing also in the previous episode, we are also far from any hint of sort of Ukrainian collapse in all of this. On the contrary, as it often happens, Goliath is the one, as showed by Spider's Web, to be the most vulnerable. Is the one that, at least in relative terms, compared also to the purpose of crushing an adversary deemed to be inferior, and that therefore does not even put this enormous strain to the existence of the adversary. That's the point. The Russians at large can be easily polarized in opinion, but they do not have moral force, which is also one of the reasons why you can send them to the slaughterhouse without saying anything. It's not a matter of strength. It's literally that they live in a typically hysterically paranoid terroristic superstition where they are absolutely, I've talked to many Russians in my life, they're absolutely aware that their government is corrupt, etc., but they can absolutely be weaponized in that way because they are trained in fear. They've been eradicated any minimal trace of tradition, whichever it is. Ukrainians sparked in a way that you would think as the underdogs of the situation, like coming from a subordinate position to the Tsarist Empire, to Russia, also within the Soviet Union, etc., would actually feel display some general, issues, a similar issue to the Russians. Instead, reacted in a way that could actually be prefigured when reading the annals of Ukrainian military history, but that are truly incredible and that match also this the partnership with the West in ways that are reminiscent of many other broader universal dynamics in European history. That is to say, when you have an enlightened elite and a people need to be redeemed by those horrifying experiences, you have really some of the most glamorous military victories. Now, regarding the enlightened elite, you can debate, but don't think that back in history, like at any point, establishments were so particularly more effective or functional or whatever. So I I'm very interested in this war for so many reasons, but want to embrace basically the entirety of at least European history and its broader Catholic meaning. That I think are dangerous. However, it's not like this war will. The most likely scenario, of course, is that at some point Russia backs down with some sort of either frozen situation, but Ukraine sufficiently solidified and Russia sufficiently tired to basically put an end to the major onslaught. But it's also a matter of like how many people died, and really how that's also yet a completely different debate. Like how willing is the Russian establishment to continue paying for this? And so whether any regime change, any government toppling or something is on the horizon. Because I don't think the Russians have any sort of idea of what it means to change, because they haven't changed anything in their history. They're probably a people incapable of changing because they lack probably the moral force to do so. But one that can at least temporarily put an end to the war per se could be still an option. Besides, we will talk now about Russians that fight actually for Ukraine against Russia that may have been well behind spider's web, because that's the metaphor of the spider's web. This is one that is entangling the entirety of Russia, as also the beautiful sort of radial distribution of these bases. In fact, the vectors of attack really show, like the fact that you cannot escape, right? You wanted to get into this quagmire. Now you're blipped up, right? And this is the main problem. How the hell to stop this? It's likely that, again, it's going to stop, and that's not just something that we really want, but it's not that it's going to stop because the Russian government is particularly convinced that this is the case. They still harbor at least the hope that at some point, through a gruesome attritional war, Ukrainians are going to yield or something by, I don't know, demographic exhaust. But that's also highly, again, unlikely. It's the notion that Ukrainians are finishing troops for some reason is never been an actual thing. At most, they had temporary recruitment cycles, shortcomings paralleled with some internal issues to American politics that went in met in some level of weapons shortages and strategic difficulties on the ground. But that's also another story. Now, so the idea that Russia has this deep philosophy that is just sure that the West is going to stop supporting Ukraine, etc., and that we will be the weak ones is actually in reality the complete opposite, right? The Russians are desperate. They do not know what to do anymore to end this, and there is no way to end that. Not even escalating, right? In any case, when you look again at the bombers, because we talk about the bombings, of course, and this terroristic strategy due to the actual target that spider's web spotted. If you remember, they initially occurred weekly with waves of hundreds of missiles with the progressive exhaustion of stocks, have become monthly and involve fewer and fewer missiles and more drones, which have much lower destructive capacity, though. So again, also the notion that the drones would be this terrific weapon, etc., is most something, by the way, that the Ukrainians can exploit because Russia is much wider and it's much easier to penetrate, all right, without adequate defenses. And so this disproportional amount of drones around is not actually conducive to a new type of warfare that is going to revolution like the artillery. This is all the usual load of BS, right? Without missiles, you can't go on for much. And again, even wasting the few missiles that you have at some point, killing civilians is so dumb it never ends. Apart from the drones, the missiles still produced and are available to Russia are of two types. Ballistic ones, very fast, with a very curved trajectory, extremely difficult to intercept, but generally less accurate due to the ineffectiveness of the GLONASS. I know it sounds funny, but this is how it's called in Russian system. And the cruise missiles, slower and easier to intercept, but also much more precise due to internal guidance. There are also the very fast ones, the so-called hypersonic ones, but extremely rare and costly, and also less precise. The Russians tested them, if you remember, early on in the war, even as far as places like in the Carpathians or something. So very much in depth in Ukraine, those that said, you can destroy London in a few minutes. And so what happens to Russia after that? Ever heard of Trident, you mother blipper? In any case, and today, by the way, the Russian embassy in the UK issued the simple statement: Russia has no plans to attack Britain. Yeah, no plans. First of all, the plans exist because everybody has such plans at some point. They must be there. But after having spent, years speaking on TV of bragging about, look, we Russians can destroy London. With the missiles, we can cause tsunamis off of London. With underwater, explosions from etc. Everybody knows that there is not a single thing that Russians say that makes any sense, or is anything but a terrible lie designed mostly for the Russian audience. That, of course, is completely inept and gullible. But I don't know how to say that. We are not the lesser people, and believe me, the Russians know perfectly well who the lesser people actually are. And that's why they behave like this. Because, what kind of, of person worth of this name actually behaves like this? Not even a schizophrenic child, right? But again, this is what essentially is normal in Russia. So as we were saying just before, to close the question of the missiles, the cruise missiles are largely launched by the strategic bombers targeted by Spider's Web. And these were modified long ago to employ cruise missiles with nuclear warheads as well. They carry out the launch from very far away, even from the Caspian, safe from, because they did that, right? Of course, Astrakhan, and, also today there were some, fortunately, false air alarms for these bombers to take off once again in retaliation, especially because of Kerch. And this is all safe from Ukrainian air defenses, which are, however, now very strong. And these modern missiles, together with drones, still manage to saturate defenses and hit Ukrainian cities monthly. But that's, again, the dumbest use you can make of this stuff. And even if these missiles do not alter the course of the battlefront, of course, they kill dozens of civilians. And that's actually the only thing that matters. Because to me, pro-Russian commentators taking the opportunity of this tragedy to remark on the internet things like resistance is futile and assimilation is inevitable is actually the same thing, highly divergent from what they also resume very often, the reality on the ground. Again, as if they were literally on the ground themselves. Like the reality on the ground tells us something very different. That is to say, disproportionate losses for basically villages turned in rubble that if they hadn't just been, somebody's homes, and that, of course, the Ukrainians fight and die for, would have been also, generally speaking, useless, except for the fact that, again, there is an advantage in the defensive and they are exploited. But imagine, the Russian army having to besiege a city like Dnipro or Kharkiv, right? It's at this point just not possible, right? At least within the range of, 4 months to be the most possibly conservative. This is not just a thing, and it won't be a thing for a very long time, hopefully, when the war will be over. Well, how does this entangle in the spider's web? Well, because, of course, destroying strategic bombers limits Russia's ability to strike Ukrainian cities. So even if, as we said before, and Cooper, for example, agrees with this damage overall is reduced by the fact that the war is really fought on the ground between hundreds of thousands of soldiers, this relentless attrition, there is some sort of greater moral, cultural, political framework to show not just that Ukrainians are capable of defending themselves and counterattacking, even reducing thus especially damage on civilians, but thus giving the soldiers on the front some more reason to fight for. This is extremely important. I mean, think of your Ukrainian soldier, you are fighting while your wife and children are targeted by the Russians. Something that Ukrainians at large do not do. On the other side, yes, they also killed civilians themselves, but there is no comparison with what the Russians have done. And also, it's just something very reduced. It's not part of their habitual strategy. Moreover, this raises even the European morale. I must say that as Europeans are quite aggressively excitable, which is an incredibly positive thing, which also depresses Russian morale that is definitely not high, has never been at any point in the war. It further reduces the capabilities of the already weakened Russian Air Force, just as the Ukrainian Air Force receives its larger numbers of F-16s, for example. And I don't want to spoiler anything also because I'm not spoiling anything. If you have been following, say, the news or at least been reading strategic analysts, you do know that basically the Russians are pushing for an intense summer offensive that, however, they do not seem to have any specific manpower like fallback plan to compensate for the losses, right? And this silent but present arrival of different aircraft to Ukraine actually suggests that the Ukrainians definitely maintain the higher ground, qualitatively speaking, are possibly going to carry out local counterattacks. We don't know which entity, unlikely to be something like in the fall of 2022, but that may be quite morally depressing for the Russians as well. As you know, I was a proponent in 2023 of not striking in Zaporizhzhia, but in Bakhmut, that did not have much, fortifications to fall back on, especially against heavy mechanized assaults from the side of the Ukrainians on the flank of the city, and that would have wiped out that dreadful, bloodshed, let's say, in terms, this would have redeemed the Ukrainians after that splendid resistance and 9 months of relentless Russian bloodbaths to secure any inch of the city by reverting the situation from a day to another. It would have not changed like any major breakthrough like in fall of 2022, but it would have literally said, okay, now start again. Do you understand from a moral point of view what kind of, okay, this is past, right? We don't make, again, history with what ifs, but at least, in fact, we don't know even how from there things would have gone. And it doesn't make much sense to wonder further. So this is very interesting. It all, the spider's web naturally contributes to alter the balance of the air war, which in turn over time will affect the balance of the ground one as well. Again, in ways that probably are not immediately expandable, but if we were to concretize what happened here, is the spider's web is a clear example of a strategic level operation, as it affects operational assets at the highest level. Russia had at most 120 strategic bombers, of which almost half were non-operational and used for cannibalization, due again to the aforementioned industrial and sort of import issues. Some had, so the replacement of same hardware, some had already been lost in the last 3 years, and now losing another 20 in one fell swoop. Again, it doesn't matter whether the 40 that some sources have said are not accurate, but it's still a lot, right? It would be still a tremendous blow to Russian air power for the gap that it provides. On top of this, this is really about what we can tell about the inside of properly the Russian Federation, Russian territory, and the way Russians are now obliged to defend their remaining assets. Normally, to deliver a strategic level blow, strategic assets are used, such as heavy bombers or long-range ballistic missiles. Ukraine has neither of these types and instead employed sabotage. The action was not managed by the Ukrainian Air Force, as we've seen, but by the military intelligence services. So it's something that strikes deeper than a mere military loss. While the Russian commandos were stupidly sacrificed in a bloodbath in the first hours of the so-called special military operation, you know what happened, right? In Kyiv, at the airport, it was a disaster. We will talk about that too at some point. The Ukrainian ones have been silently at work for 3 years. And that's when you have to get scared. Because also the Ukrainians, by the way, as you know, we commented on this, get that kind of, in their own way, in their Ukrainian way, that Soviet legacy vibe in terms, we're not even going to tell you what is going to happen, right? We are just silent. And that's the scary part, right? Well, you can immediately understand that when Russia is desperate, because they talk too much, right? And also to say unusually stupid things, which for them is actually even more impressive, right? And the Ukrainians, jokes aside, have really gone through something that the Russians haven't the palest idea of, even if they were the perpetrators. And so this is at some point to be spent, right? During the war, we have heard dozens of times about mysterious fires in the industries and refineries across Russia, and also about mysterious drone attacks in locations far from the Ukrainian front. Well, now we have a clearer idea of how these actions take place. Simply, the Russian Federation is deeply infiltrated by a true Ukrainian and, interestingly enough, or pro-Ukrainian spider's web clandestine network. This is the biggest thing that we should get, in my opinion, by this operation. That is the real spider's web, right? And there is just so much that you can do to move around it before you realize you're forever entangled with that. So if you will go down, right? This is not a matter of if, this is just a matter of when. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, this is a very dangerous game, but it's also the only one that, after all, the Russians decided they had to be in. So there are ways out of this that may be fortunate for, let's say, everybody involved, at least for the world, but it's also one of those entanglements that really speak of venom and of death. Now, how this could have happened, by the way, in Russia, in a police state so tightly controlled by the security services, hairs of the KGB, by the way, that were not exactly, they were actually good, at least in some things, and you may, of course, indeed feel it's strange, but this is actually the effect of Putin's policy. And I don't want to digress in the KGB history, etc., because it's also an incredibly dark history. It's not like the Soviets ever had anything functional, for that matter, in a bigger competitive sense. But they had the worst of that, at least in the end. So what happened? On the one hand, the war has gradually absorbed more and more military, and therefore police resources, leaving much of the territory without protection. So just banally, remember Prigozhin's uncontested right from Rostov to the outskirts of Moscow with only 5,000 men. This is not... Russia is also not so big as it's... Like, on maps, when you flatten the geoid, it seems like Russia is huge, but it's actually not huge, right? Moscow and Kyiv are actually pretty close. And in general... if Prigozhin had different intentions, he was pretty dumb in many ways. He could have really harmed very badly. Not much by that right that revealed itself sort of unsuccessful, but by, for example, which Wagner would have not done, but it was still, of course, in terms of intelligence and, of course, talks that exist across sides, an opportunity, attacking the same Russian front line, especially in concert with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, right? And that was the greatest hope, right? What we said applies also to air defense, which in addition to being worn down by Ukrainian attacks, is also dispersed over a vast territory. Ukrainian pressure pushed Russian air operations deeper beyond the reach of Storm Shadows, Scalp, HIMARS, and drones. Remote bases like Belaya and Ukrainka reduce exposure to conventional attacks but increase vulnerability to infiltration. Exactly because they are inland, right? It's as if this factor that seemed initially a defensive one, Russia is so big here, they can't use forces whenever they want, they have the means to relocate, whatever. This only amplifies the threat. Surrounding sparse areas lack patrols, aiding covert drone deployments. When you look at Spider's Web through the videos, you see minimal defenses. One soldier with a light machine gun, like resembling outdated anti-aircraft systems, ineffective against FPV drones. Panzer system counter larger drones but struggle with small, low-flying FPVs. Jamming may counter future attacks, but because, let's be honest, everything adapts, right? And what the Ukrainians have done with this apparently completely autonomously operating drones may easily be down in a counter drone function in the future. And that's also why, again, I think that there is a limit, of course, to drone potential. And it's not like we have infinite resources just to specialize in drones and worries about drones. No, we won't get there in the short or not even in the medium run, but probably not even the long one. God knows what there will be at that point. Surely not this type of warfare. But let's say when, for example, jamming itself still requires precise timing, which Russia in this context lacked, because as you understood, everything was very sudden. This is, by the way, and just to tell you how that I am objective, I try to stay objective, this is the same for NATO. It's not like, I don't know, if you have 500 Amazon drones used at some, I don't know, NATO bases like, I don't know, Camp Darby or whatever, like, you know, we have actually the means to simply counter this quickly, but we're NATO. It's a completely different situation. We will not digress here on the posture that Russia had towards NATO and all this, because again, it's a topic we partially addressed in the previous video about Ukraine, but also tangentially, we will, if anything, need another video just for that. Surrounding forests offer, for example, short response times causing superficial damage. 2 years ago, predictions foresaw drone-dominated warfare with 60-70% of Ukraine's tactical attacks drone-based. And again, that's not actually how things are. Now, future wars may use, as we said, counter drones with AI. Also imagine the narrow-mindedness of someone like Putin, who claims that the Ukrainian national identity does not exist, and having something from 2 to 6 million Russian citizens of Ukrainian ethnicity who speak Russian as their mother tongue, perfectly integrated into Russian society, and probably more than happy to offer the Ukrainian intelligence, in enough cases, a support base for acquiring information, and now also for executing operations in complete safety. The organization of a clandestine network in enemy territory requires time, not months, but years. We've seen it in many contexts, especially with some of the most famous guerrilla, right? Without drawing parallelisms, here we're not talking about, I don't know, a feudal Islamic tribal reality like Afghanistan. All right, here we have Ukraine with the resources of a nation state with extensive prior tradition in subversive activities. In fact, the KGB was also theirs, without mentioning that Ukraine was actually the beating heart of Soviet technology at the time. And still, actually, also through attacks like this, proves such legacy by developing it further. After 3 years of war, the Ukrainian network in Russia is now moving from the phase of simple intelligence gathering and recruitment to that of direct action. This is without even addressing the enormous shortcomings of the Russian security forces, of intelligence, just think about the massacre in the theater, also settlements. We've seen it with Wagner, with explosions in bars in St. Petersburg, etc. This is just, you think it's normal that maybe the Russians are habituated to this kind of, no, it's even more crippling in such a sick society that, again, has some astonishing fundamentals. To make things even more worrying for Russia, there is another factor that is little discussed and could instead be, if not at the basis of the Ukrainian clandestine organization, at least a long-term supporting factor. We were hinting at before. We also talked in the last episode about the Russian volunteers, not just from the Russian Federation, but also from Belarus, etc. But in particular, do you remember the Free Russia Legion? Right, this participated in the first Ukrainian offensive in Kursk and then disappeared from the media screens. So these were essentially Russians who apparently joined forces with Ukrainians. Actually, most of them were within Ukraine from a long time. And Ukraine, of course, has Russian citizens that also sided, of course, with Ukraine, regardless of the 99.9% pro-Russia plebiscites in the various oblasts yet to conquer, by the way. So that the percentage would be interesting to assess also in many ways. But again, Russians do not even understand. I don't know if you ever talked to one, but the difference between absolute and relative. I'm not kidding. Like, ask them, if you really want to make them phobic, ask them what objective truth is. They're literally, it's just like showing garlic to a vampire. They immediately freak out. They immediately start going bananas, right? It's something incredible. It's some, psychologically speaking, and more seriously as well, it's something unbelievable. I honestly, in the West, have never seen a behavior like I've seen similar behaviors in terms of, being denying responsibility, but the mere fact that the concept of objective, this were people who sent scientists to the gulags because they dared say that it was a genetic inheritance, right? There were specific differences between people and properly different values in notion, right? And it's not like, the Soviet Union ended. All of a sudden, these people actually reason as normal human beings. This is a completely different story. These people went through the Mongols. They went through Tsarism, not just the Soviet Union. This is something insane, right? You barely find in any other so-called European context, because whether the Russians like it or not, they're Westerners as well, at least in a conventional sense. Any kind of this behavior is utterly incredible. But in any case, those Russians claiming properly to liberate the Russian Federation from the Ukrainian offensive into Kursk have disappeared from the media entirely. The operation in Kursk represented a successful diversion for what it was worth it for the Ukrainians, also in the broader context of, again, the American administration change, or some unknowns to show that they could counter-strike, etc. But aside from that, among the various things, also a unique infiltration opportunity for the militias of Russian dissidents, right, to Putin, whose structure was more insurrectional than conventional, by the way. And today, these Russian fighters could be deeply infiltrated in the Federation's territory, armed and equipped by Ukraine, and in coordination with the GUR. In this perspective, Operation Spider's Web takes on a much less surprising, but also sort of apparently much less publicized aspect, which is definitely very important. This scenario also raises significant concerns for global military aviation, implying reliance on AI-guided drones for terminal targeting with profound implications for any air force. The operation scale is unprecedented, which makes it amazing just for that alone, with drones launched from multiple regions across Russia, including Siberia. This synchronized attack, executed nearly simultaneously across 5 time zones, underscores its complexity. Before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had to go on spying the actual ships, U.S. ships in the port. Now, just with satellite images, we can, and just preset coordinates, etc., we can immediately get the targets recognized by AI alone in loco. Previous Ukrainian drone attacks from within Ukraine relied on basic satellite coordinates, just like the ones you can get from Google. But Russian defenses are assumed to include basic jammers, necessitating at least a two-phase approach. So you have the initial satellite-guided navigation, followed by AI-driven terminal targeting to avoid decoys. This two-phase approach is considered the most robust hypothesis of how things work here, as exclusive AI used from launch to impact would be misled by false targets, and current technology cannot guide drones autonomously over such distances. The AI's role is likely limited as to the final targeting phase, ensuring precision against actual aircraft rather than decoys. Nevertheless, again, how these drones were actioned just per se, as we explained, it's not just the most important aspect. It's the fact that this could be carried out in the first place. It was organized within Russia. That is really clamorous. NATO's potential involvement was questioned by people, with the only plausible contribution being satellite imagery, not exclusive to NATO, by the way, as commercial sources are available as well. Frequent satellite coverage is critical as Russian bombers are relocated to avoid attacks, a key defensive strategy, because, again, drone attacks had already been carried out, causing losses, not to this scale. Ukrainian forces use commercial imagery, purchased by analysts with possible on-ground operatives for real-time confirmation. The operation's autonomy relies on internal targeting, as external assistance, like, for example, for Storm Shadow missiles, is inapplicable. Large bombers are visible on low-resolution satellites like Sentinel, publicly accessible. In fact, we used this before as a source, aiding targeting without advanced intelligence. Russian air bases lack extensive hangars, as bombers are parked openly due to operational cycles and limited storage as well. Moving aircraft, loading ammo, and hangar operations increase risks, so aircraft are kept on runways loaded only when needed. Right, so you don't need to move them around more than much within the airfield, because it could cause further problems. They're mostly supplied in local, and also this, as we'll see now, enables them to move them more quickly. Which also explains, by the way, why these planes were loaded in fuel as well, which would be, for example, like a measure to prevent them from being exposed to drone attacks and being worn in time, like being able to take off immediately. So for those who say, but why were they loaded in fuel? Like, are they dumb? Like, they're attacked, they explode better? No, not really. It's mostly, but possibly because of this. But there are also certain things we don't know just in the immediate details. We can get through different sources, but are also relatively redundant. Surely, of course, the intelligence here knew that very well. Now, Russian bases near Ukraine have added fortifications, but remote bases like Belaya lack such measures, for example, which means also that these fortifications and any other defensive measure will have to be implemented with costs, personnel, workforce, etc. Now, this START treaty, that is the famous bilateral agreement aimed at reducing limited strategic offensive arms between the United States and Russia, does not mandate open storage, allowing bombers to be hidden except during tests or decommissioning. Thus, claims the START force exposure are unfounded, as are theories of a Ukrainian trap. Some damaged aircraft may be former Ukrainian assets transferred to Russia post-Soviet collapse, paradoxically, used for parts or modernization. By the way, so literally, right, some of these planes were literally built in Ukraine to be destroyed in Russia by Ukrainians, which is, of course, quite telling of much of this whole, story and successful Ukrainian enterprise. Videos show drones targeting fuel tanks and wings, as we said before, maximizing damage by igniting fires, with AI trained on these areas, as shown in released images. Assessment drones transmitted footage via Russia's cellular network, likely pre-programmed to loiter, not control remotely, explaining limited imagery from some bases at least. The signal's transmission remains partially unresolved, likely via cellular networks. Russian countermeasures like tires on aircraft to disrupt silhouette recognition may have reduced success by altering profiles, confusing AI. Right? This is also an aspect that was used also in other wars, right? And this may work with this AI optic recognition. Tires stacked on wings break recognizable silhouettes, a method informed, by the way, by Russia's drone experience. They offer no physical protection but interfere with AI, as drones rely on visual contrast especially. Tire stockpiles at parking areas suggest there's a deliberate strategy possibly tested with Russian drones in the same bases or elsewhere. Effectiveness is unknown, as the number of drones reaching targets, let's say, 1/5 of the world versus those disrupted is unclear. Also in the world picture even more. Tires were noted in prior analysis, evident in satellite imagery across airbases. Silhouette disruption draws from older technologies like Soviet air-launched missiles with electro-optical guidance, where pilots selected a target's contrast and the missile guided itself. So it's not like these technologies did not exist before. They existed even in the Cold War, like the fact that an AI would essentially be able to, by being fed with particular patterns, would be able to literally lock on a specific target and hit them in that way. It existed, right, both in NATO and Soviet technology. By the way, US and other nations have similar systems today. Consider that during World War II, there were experiments to train pigeons to peg ship silhouettes for missile guidance via reinforcement. So, again, this was a very early concern, especially of digital technology. Modern AI evolves, of course, from pixel-based contrast recognition, which was feasible at least since the late 90s. So we shouldn't be surprised that this technology is there. We should be surprised by the fact that this incredibly sophisticated operation was successfully orchestrated, also thanks to the help of technology, quite complex organization, regardless properly to these technical aspects, because you must be sure that after all this extremely risky work, where lots of people have risked their lives, God knows, like some may have been taken and killed in the process, we're not told, but you must really have incredibly competent people that are sure that this system is going to work when eventually occurring, right? Because there may be a single major factor that largely disrupts the effectiveness of this all. It's not like, again, the Russians weren't shooting from the ground trying to take the drones down. Now, Russian aircraft are fueled at air bases for rapid takeoff against attacks, as we were saying before. Especially slow Ukrainian drones from Ukraine are considered to be at this point the timing. We're talking normally hours before those arrive, as the signal, the scramble order is issued, right? So which already put a lot of pressure actually on the Russian air forces, which explains fuel presence, making aircraft vulnerable to drone strikes on tanks. This may have been also, it would have been always a concern, but it may have been very well known by the same Ukrainians. Let's not strike in this way, let them habituate to load their planes in this way. By the way, MiG-31s at Belaya were struck centrally, reflecting different fuel placement. Imagery from a couple of days ago shows Belaya with 39 Tupolev 22 M3s and 30 MiG-31s with an error in not targeting the latter sole Kinzhal carriers. Most MiG-31s at Belaya are standard fighters or awaiting modernization, with 10 to 20 converted for Kinzhal missiles use stored closely, indicating non-operational status. By the way, targeting them would have limited impact. Belaya rarely attack serves as a storage hub, possibly explaining fewer tire countermeasures. What remains to be commented on is one aspect. What could have been any Western involvement in this operation? Because, again, the Russophiles have to whine about this. We do not know. There are hypotheses that can be made. So, first of all, NATO, as you know, it is just like a sum of different sovereign powers, and the current at least ambiguous policy of the Trump administration makes the involvement of the alliance as such highly unlikely. The risk of leaks would have been intolerable for the GUR in particular. So probably the Ukrainians did this mostly keeping it fairly secret from most international agencies, except for the most loyal ones that you can easily imagine would come from the British MI6, right? This is exactly, by the way, the type of action in which the British MI6 specializes. So given, as you know, British position on Ukraine, it's also pretty likely. However, it's also true that given the Ukrainians' intelligence and technological capabilities, such a support might not have been necessary at all, right? It may have helped, but we don't know anything of this, frankly. But it's definitely possible that Ukrainians, of course, maintain also certain knowledge for themselves. The coordinates at the air bases have always been known to the GUR. Airports don't move much, indeed, and the presence of large aircraft on the runways cannot be hidden, not only from commercial satellites, but also from Ukrainian origin farmers, say, living nearby, or the Free Russia Legion militias camping in the nearby woods, right? So the level of permeability of the Russian Federation is as high as the regime of the Bear Vladimir is rotten from the within. Naturally, any other speculation regarding this that involves, in fact, a much greater spread of Ukrainian intelligence, also entailing some, at least, knowledge from NATO, is something we don't have, obviously, open material to discuss on. It could be. You understand here all the topics that we could cover about just from this event, and that's how sort of passionate I am myself in this topic. Going back to Tom Cooper's analysis, he estimates 2 Tupolev 95M destroyed, 1 damage, 1 AN-12 hit with no significant disruption. Russia's rotation, 5 to 10 bombers per mission, answer plus 135 bombers, 40-50 Tupolev 95Ms, many Tupolev 22M3s ensure, of course, continuity, as 20 losses would not alter campaigns. However, the ramifications of this, at least the implications also for having for this operation to have happened in the first place are much deeper. I think that Cooper is not necessarily considering this. I haven't read whether he has published anything new. It's not like a particular point of reference in absolute terms for me personally, as I can browse these things a bit on my own. But the general impression is that, again, this is not enough. Definitely. This may even be some kind of secondary loss inflicted, but the ramifications are enormous. Especially, again, we'll make that video about the Taranto, the British raid on Taranto. Like, that will tell us why comparatively this was important. It wasn't much just because it inspired Pearl Harbor, etc. The Japanese visited southern Italy to grab information about that within the Axis connector, but it's mostly, in fact, about the inactability of this. How was it even possible that these gaps were found, highlighting there is some further weakness to exploit, aside from all what, again, the Ukrainians through their intelligence already know regarding the clandestine resistance to Putin's regime and more. In the heart of the Russian Federation, right? So, surely from a propagandistic point of view, the value of the operation is also high. It's a beautiful coup. Practical impact is, if we assess it properly in terms of operational or material losses, again, this is surely complicating the Russian doing behind the scenes, but it's in this sense not immediately translatable in any immediate, let's say, decrease of, say, Russian pressure per se. Consider that Russia uses air, ground, sea launches, 40% air launched per 2024 Ukrainian data. Shahed missiles with larger warheads replace cruise missiles, but as we've seen, they're also less effective to some extent. Targeting Tupolev 95 MS to bring in the KH-101 is less critical than the Tupolev 22M3 equipped with the KH either 22 or 33. With fewer losses. A single type like the Tupolev 95 MS or MiG-31K would have greater impact. Russia produces only Tupolev 160s at 1-2 per year, just to give you a dimension of the wall. This had resumed recently, by the way, just 3 of these bombers produced since 2022. The Tupolev 95 MS and 22M3 production ceased with modernization of parts use. So the Tupolev 160s, say 50 to 20 at this point, are critical. Likely they were missed somewhere at Kazan for modernization. So at least this may explain the problems. The A50 loss may be significant because, again, there were very few. There was just one operational. So we don't know about the other losses also in the broader raid. It's not fully clear. So if we assume that even this latter was knocked out, there is some relevant loss. But again, it's not like immediately altering the whole scenario. Besides, Shahed production is hard to disrupt using mobile low-tech setups. So this is what the Russians are basically after at this point, like cheap quantity, right? That's it. Past depot strikes like at Lipetsk cut fab use for 2 months. As you know, this is a problem because the Russians rely very much on that kind of very archaic, now as they don't commit their air force, if not in with those fabs shot at times at 60, 70 kilometers from within Russia, with unrealistic chances of Ukrainians to hit them at that distance, are the way they paved the way properly to infantry in some cases, even though you can't really think to destroy every Ukrainian position with fabs, and just bombs do not actually dislodge infantry, and you must storm those strongholds anyway, for how messed up, by the way, they have become themselves with infantry that has to take losses. It's just a very primitive way of fighting that the Russians resorted to because they decided to pull out with essentially their air force from essentially close support to infantry due to the heavy losses that were sustaining, especially at the beginning of the war. That's why, especially this war, are such scarce airborne activities from the Russian side. In the Ukrainian case, it's because most of their air force was down in the early phases of the war, and they're gradually rebuilding, mostly with Western help, with the hope of resuming, in fact, more close, say closely coordinated operations with ground forces. This is naturally challenging also for them in the future, because the Russians have their own AA means as well. Airbase munition strikes disrupted operations, forcing relocations, increasing wear. Of course, Ukrainian strikes on early warning and defenses create gaps, enabling attacks like a submarine sinking in dry dock or Crimean defense hits. Russia may centralize or disperse aircraft, raising costs and wear. Canceling the A100, A, W, and C reflects reliance on refurbished A50s, prioritizing quantity over advanced systems. That again is the really the Russian thing at the moment, right? The A, E, W, and C is the airborne early warning and control. So the whatever losses specifically in this raid, it's not like the Russians are working so say surgically with synergic operations. Like it's mostly they radically dropped the quality of the collective training, etc., just because they also get those more pressing demands from the higher command and political direction, for which that is not needed, which means they will keep dying in really high and on the long run really unsustainable, or just like really unforgivable numbers. Future asymmetric attacks of this kind are likely. Even though Ukrainian ingenuity is really evident, right? The slogan "Strike the archer, not the arrow" contrasts with depot strikes that removed arrows. Pressures increases Russian aircraft wear, especially the Sukhoi 34s, with thousands of sorties causing crashes from fatigue. So also the notion that now, I remember once, the weirdest Russophilic, this was not even Russian propaganda to an extent, because it's mostly like that simping for like, oh, now the Russian Air Force has this huge experience. It's not really the type of experience you need in a conventional in a conventional war. NATO air superiority is crushing, right? The notion that the Russian pilots at this point would be, all aces capable of doing who knows what. It's simply, out of reality. Besides, they are living an incredibly wearing life. They have much less sort of expendability than we think. Ukrainian strategy at this point may push Russian operations deeper to increase flight hours and fatigue, by the way, exploiting reactivated, poorly defended bases that may not be probably the best at all, and increase general costs, and also in coordination, just in fuel and so on. Russian aircraft already move constantly, complicating targeting. But infiltration overcame even this, right? This is really interesting. Also, trying to transpose this on, for example, a future confrontation between the US and China, or at least any kind of Pacific crisis involving consistent air and naval forces at that point. You would see drone swarms targeting assets like fifth generation fighters, for example. But it's just an hypothesis. A submarine, say, launching 1,000 drones against Guam or Midway, who knows, showing potential. Because, you see, with Russia at least, or Ukraine as well, you have this immense territories, right? In the Pacific, you can't really target a single island that is that launching pad and really saturating it with drones and raising it to the ground. So altering all of a sudden much greatly this strategic balance involved, right? So as we've seen, even with Ukraine, the Ukrainian splendid success that is very, very high politically in front of the allies, morally for the populace, and for the broader implications that the intelligence success can allow perpetuating through this broader web of other opportunities, not just attacks to the airfields. This is just one option, then surely they have others at play. But in the Pacific, it would be really something different, right? Consider how Ukraine, by the way, speaking of naval warfare, how Ukraine basically inhibited the use of an entire navy, inflicting heavy losses without a navy to the opponent. So it's something incredible. And drones and missiles converge with drones as low-cost ammo, with mostly range issues at this point, at least. So you can't really substitute missiles at this point. But a type of more desperate and attritional warfare may see, of course, a greater use of drones that are not optimal in this sense, may be good enough, but cannot eliminate missiles. Just think about how useful for Taiwan's defense against China lots of drones can be, right? The Chinese, famously enough, created pigeon-looking guided drones, which are exactly supposed to look like birds, not to be shot down. They're incredible. Google them because they're really cute. I guess pigeons are weird, telling the truth, but you can appreciate how this really looks like a bird, and it's difficult to spot the difference on the distance. Then all the other details about Artem Timofeyev, the drivers, the Aguilev and Ukrainka, will at some point emerge. Probably in the last hours, something has already happened. I don't know. I should check that. If anything, we will talk about this in another video. Everything is temporary. Everything is just a momentary assessment, right? So, to make the long story short, Spider's Web is a major asymmetric achievement. Its impact on Russian missile campaigns is limited by reserves in diverse platforms. We are also to see how Russia responds to this in a broader fashion. This is mostly a political rather than strategical issue. which hopefully will not occur, but would sure potential Ukrainian replication in new forms of responses, counter attacks that can at this point take really a prototype look, given probably the increasing assets really in an ever wearier and paranoid Russia, right? We are talking here, CIS data shows that Russian military forces have failed to effectively advance along multiple axes in Ukraine and will likely hit the 1 million casualty mark by summer 2025. So this is not normal, right? This is not how a war is waged. I'm actually appalled at how the broader reaction to the war in Ukraine is for multiple reasons. I would say from both sides, right? Of course, Russophiles are the worst in many ways, but that are really anthropological in nature. It's not just because you support what Russia or Putin is doing, but just depending on where you come from, it's something more or less, but in this sense, not short of outrageous. You're ridiculously deluding yourself of benefiting from just because, you basically don't want to accept that the problem is you, right? It's not like society has failed you. You're just a lesser person that thinks that somebody can do the work for you without actually going anywhere, because it's not like you're actively supporting that cause. You're just basically stalling some help. You're not creating anything positive from the other side, right? This is a very important divide. It's not like if you cross your arms, you're simply creating more than, for example, I can be creating even just by making a video like this and doing what I do in my life, hopefully to some extent, useful in favor of Ukraine. Again, everybody can be partisan, but you can't say that these things are irrelevant or morally comparable, right? I'm using even a familiar tone because I'm talking to people that are just watching a YouTube video from a military history channel that doesn't even focus on, specializes on this, but at least that takes its time, it's evident here, to cover the whole thing in an adequate way, hopefully. But also from the pro-Ukrainian side, because it doesn't seem to me that, in fact, that, let's say, passion for the cause has actually led to any specific improvement of people's realization of how important this war actually is and how it is actually fought as well, or what we could or should expect from this. Again, there are good analysts out there, much better than me. I may recompose some of these views to express some general insight that I noticed there's this dynamic maybe helps. Strategic analysts sometimes are scared to say what they truly think because they are very often very sort of publicly traceable people. I'm not saying that since I've not made any reveal about my person that this is basically the reason why I don't do that. But let's say these are people who really provide with at times the raw data, right? Or at least they're not the ones who do that. But let's say for the general audience, right? They are summarizing from backgrounds that they assume to be specialistic enough for the point of not having to guess what is going to happen or what kind of take the reason does. And as I said before, many of them are not actually specialized in the art of war, in military history. So in my opinion, they have a narrower political view and sort of a much less... they insist, for example, very contemporary subdivisions. For example, there is this adjective operational. In many cases, it's not really necessary to stress because there isn't really something in between strategy and tactics like this. So they have very notionistic attitudes stemming from basically studying from maybe more contemporary publishing about what also the military does in these circles that are supposed to be on the civilian side, sort of more expert about current warfare. So you're expert about warfare in general, modern say contemporary politics and geopolitics. Geopolitics does not exist, by the way. and have not seen the thing in some broader depth or in some broader fluidity, and may not have even ever studied von Clausewitz, as I instead claim to have done. At least we have seen most of that work online, or even maybe not most of it, because I apply von Clausewitz to anything that I really do, so it extends beyond. But it seems to me that, in fact, the idea of having a stained reputation, right, from maybe wrong assessment or whatever, is even just by habit, bringing them to stick to a specific level of the analysis and not talking so much about the rest, right? I try to see the thing as a whole, and what this could mean also in a broader historical, political, and moral sense, but starting from what happens from the actual battlefield. So again, I think that there is really a lot of room for making a much better job. In many ways, I cover the war in Ukraine now for the first time on the channel, as you know, and I hope to grow better at it. So I hope this series is going to be as short as possible, believe me. But unfortunately, this also looks like a war that, although maybe it could wind down actually within this month as well. Like there is no limit to that. But it's also a type of war that is in any way, say, not ending a broader conflict that is being triggered now by dynamics that still heighten the risk also for other regions, for the broader, again, usefulness that it has to those who have started it without actually having thought of a real end game, because they have the tools to protract it, even though it's also risky on their side, and in fact really a tunnel that they can't quite clearly get out of. And in fact, the spider's web is meant to dramatically show this, except again, you in this web, the spider has caught like something huge that can even die, but can say, I want to say terrible things. I think everything will end more smoothly than most believe. But I always thought it since the beginning. Even when we had these predictions, and I absolutely believed that the war would last so long and would go on, could really drag on for a long time, but still in ways that, in fact, are not escalatory, right? But can really set the conditions for, in fact, escalating in other contexts that are less controlled, less checked, and creating other issues around the world in a moment of general crisis that usually does not bring good things. So again, nobody can predict the futures. I can't do it. Strategic analysts can't as well. But of course, listening to many voices at the same time, understanding that there is a specific expertise and that the war is not a matter of what you personally wish to go like is in both ways. Like it's not really a mature argument. And the matter must be handled quite carefully. So I hate to conclude videos by myself not providing with an actual answer, but because I wouldn't be honest with you if I did. I have my own ideas in general, right? I actually do believe that there is a likely winner here. The point is, it doesn't, and I thought it since the beginning of the war, regardless of the fact that, the war still drags on, right? But this is exactly the point. I want to maintain with you an open channel of communication, so to say, regardless the sentiment of this war, like why this terrible thing exists, and let's say, having a comforting narrative regarding the fact that yes, it's not like we've seen this specific war before, like as every war is unique. But when you eliminate the background noise, you really focus on the fundamentals. It really boils down to very simple things. As von Clausewitz also pointed out, war is difficult, but it's simple, really, and especially the bigger the war is. And I think here that the matter is really very simple, right? As how negatively it may sound, especially to anyone who lives in it, and that is really losing their lives in the process. But it's not like the war is not clear. Actually, I can say by experience, knowing who lives there, that there things are much clearer, in fact, than what are here. And once that you understand that if things here were immediately clarified for everyone, and so that people made just that minimal intellective effort to realize the obvious, this war would end quite quickly, right? And that's the actual problem of this all, that it's all on all of us. It's not like, again, it's somebody else's fault, as also especially one side of the story would like to tell, like it's, there are some hidden reasons or like conspiracy theories, etc. Here, the picture is quite simple. Is that under everybody's eyes, it was since the beginning, what do you want, right? Again, I hope that this series will not really be continued, but unfortunately, I presume that it's going to be the case. So we'll stay tuned. I plan to keep making videos. I do them about any other topic of the usual ones that we deal with. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.